brain that makes you socially acceptable, gives you restraint. And if you look at the different prefrontal cortexes of the different type of species, man is bigger than monkey, is bigger than mouse, is bigger than teenage brain. So when we look a little bit more at the prefrontal cortex, caveman had a strong prefrontal cortex. It overrode the urges from the back of the limbic system, which says, eat, sex, rock and roll, do things novel. But in today's man, these urges overpower our prefrontal cortex. Something about sugar and fat and its effect on the midbrain rewires our neurochemistry and perhaps even our neuroanatomy. So let's look a little bit about this midbrain that has been influenced so much by different eating habits. So my pointer probably isn't going to be able to hit the exact spots that I want to point out to you, but on your right side of the screen, you see a bunch of yellow dots in something that looks like a neuron. That neuron is called a presynaptic neuron because there's a little space between it and the other neuron on the left. That space is called the synapse. So the presynaptic neuron in our midbrains contains dopamine. And when we see something that we want or hear about something really delicious, any of you eat that chocolate last night? Your dopamine is secreting right now, just because you're thinking about it. So dopamine gets released across the synaptic membrane and it goes to the postsynaptic membrane where it binds to dopamine receptors. And these dopamine receptors deliver the signal to the postsynaptic neuron, and then pleasure is felt. Now, let's discuss a working hypothesis of food addiction. On the upper part of your screen, you see a young lady who was a prudent eater. She has been on the Leon Hart diet. She eats well all her life. She sees a nice piece of chocolate. She eats that chocolate. She's like the old caveman. She has good eating habits. And that chocolate releases dopamine, and the dopamine goes across the synaptic membrane, and it binds to receptors, and she feels pleasure, and she doesn't want any more. Now, let's take the bottom situation. Let's go into the overeater's neurochemistry. This is all happening in the midbrain. So you don't stop at one chocolate. You actually start drinking shakes. And you drink one shake, and you drink two shakes, and you drink three shakes. Well, your body your dopamine gets released, it starts to attach to those receptors initially, you start to get great pleasure. But your body fights back a little bit. Notice that there's 5 receptors on the top neuron and only 2 receptors on the bottom neuron. That's called the downregulation of dopamine receptors. So even though you're releasing a lot of dopamine because you're eating a lot of this delicious junk food, you're getting less pleasure out of it because there's nothing for the dopamine to bind to. So you eat more trying to get more pleasure. And then you say, oh, I'm just eating too much. I'm going to stop eating this. So now you have too few receptors, and you start making less dopamine, and you start to go through withdrawal. You see, not being able to get more pleasure with more eating is tolerance, and stopping and having symptoms of stopping is withdrawal. That fits most of the definitions of addiction. Some people, I believe that food is addiction. So I'm going to go through a couple of famous experiments. Actually, 2 of these were done in Florida at Scripps Institute by Dr. Paul Kaye, who I had the pleasure of meeting and doing another lecture with. He took rats, and he injected these poor rats with a virus that attacked and diminished their dopamine receptors. And these rats didn't get a fever and die. They started to eat, and they actually engorged themselves because their dopamine receptors would not allow them to feel the pleasure of eating, so they just ate more. And in the bottom part of this slide, Dr. Paul Kaye, formerly of Scripps, also took rats who ate normal rat food. He gave them hamburgers and shakes and everything bad, and he did this for 3 weeks. And then he took away the food. And guess what happened? He gave them back their rat chow. They wouldn't eat the rat chow. They'd rather starve than eat the rat chow. And this starvation went on for 3 weeks. before, presumably, the receptors started to regenerate on the postsynaptic membrane, allowing some pleasure to occur with their eating. And then finally, and I believe this slide was shown before, if you put electrodes into rat brains and stimulate the dopamine release, and they can push a lever and get dopamine stimulation and real pleasure, they'll ignore their food. Studies like this highly suggest that junk food, is addicting. So how can we get our prefrontal cortex stronger? How can we get our prefrontal cortex to override the urges of the limbic system? First of all, we have to understand that the prefrontal cortex does not have unlimited reserves. There was a study done at Stanford University where they took several dozen people and divided them into 2 groups. One group was simply told, memorize 2 numbers. The other group was told, memorize 7 numbers. After their feats were accomplished, all the subjects were told, we're now going to go into the next room and do some more work. And they said, by the way, as we walk into the next room, grab some fruit or grab some cake. The 7 number memorizers grabbed twice as much cake than they did food. So think about it. When you go home at night and you're really tired, that's when you screw up. When your prefrontal cortex is exhausted, it's very important to keep our prefrontal cortex as strong as possible. There's a neurocognitive connection that takes place. Exercise strengthens our prefrontal cortex. Exercise by functional MRI can actually increase the size of our prefrontal cortex. Practicing restraint and good habits also can increase the blood flow and size of our prefrontal cortex. On the other flip side of the coin, being a couch potato, not moving, will allow the limbic system to overpower the prefrontal cortex because the prefrontal cortex simply loses its ability to have restraint and control the situation. Stress is in this society, we have so much stress. Stress diminishes the capacity of the prefrontal cortex. The 2 marshmallow experience. Children who are given 1 marshmallow right now or 2 marshmallows tomorrow. The ones who chose 2 marshmallows, when they grow up, they have higher SAT scores, they're more socially acceptable, they earn higher incomes. These are individuals that had development of their prefrontal cortex at an early age. And this is something that is not predetermined. We can actually develop strong prefrontal cortex in our children by teaching them discipline, not to whine when they stand in line, finish the chores that they do, and have good habits from a young age to increase this prefrontal cortex restraint. Marijuana. Everyone likes to talk about marijuana. So there's a rumor that marijuana causes you to want to eat more, that I've heard. And we actually have cannabis receptors in our brain. So previously, scientists said, well, if there are cannabis receptors in our brain that cause munchies, there should be something, we can give people medication that block the marijuana receptors. And that medication actually came out, and it caused good weight loss. But what happened was these people became depressed. Some of them jumped off bridges, and so that works on hold for a little bit. There are a lot of new medications out. My purpose today is not to discuss all the new medications, but I want to just look at the bottom one. Liraglutide. We're already using this in lower doses in diabetics. This is GLP-1. You all remember that at the beginning of my lecture, I told you that GLP-1 is released by the intestines when you eat, and it goes to the brain to stop you from eating, and it stops the stomach from churning, keeping the food there longer, giving a sense of satiety. GLP-1 is moving through FDA approval in a 3 milligram dose. This is going to be a very strong signal that we're going to be able to inject under the skin and send a message to the brain, strongly controlling appetite. So there's a lot. I'm not going to go over all the new neurochemical active hormones that we have, but I want to let you know that there's a lot of research being done in this area. Now I just want to talk the last few minutes about a concept called mindful eating. Mindful is paying attention to something on purpose. Mindful eating works like this. When you go home at night, I would encourage you to shut off your telephones, to put away the newspapers, curtail the bad gossip, turn off all the electronics, and everybody take deep breaths. Because deep breathing really calms the nerves. And eat your food and pay attention to what you're putting in your mouth. Taste it. Taste the texture. Feel the texture. Is it acidic? Is it sweet? Smell it. Enjoy it. Because studies show, and I think as Dr. Larson points out, you don't have to quote-unquote watch calories. You just have to do what's right. If you do this, if you just pay attention to your food, pay attention to what you're eating, you will get reward. You will get pleasure. So you won't look for more reward, and you won't look for more pleasure. And you'll have a natural diminishment of what you eat. Hunger versus satiety. Hunger is a pain. Hunger is a pain that builds up slowly. You feel weak and irritable. Satiety is feeling stuffed. When we go to the table, we have to go with a certain level of hunger, and we have to leave that table before a certain level of satiety occurs. So in the essence of time, I'm not going to list all 10 levels of hunger going to satiety. I just want to say that you should start eating when you're a little hungry. If you start eating when you're famished, it's over. You have to have your meals when you're a little hungry. You have to pay attention as you eat to how your body feels. It's okay to feel a little full, but so many times I hear, I'm stuffed, and that should never happen. If you simply stop eating when you're a little full versus stuffed, calories will be reduced. A way to do this is to visually divide your plate into 4 quadrants, 5 minutes each. Take 20 minutes. And there's an actual physiological theory behind this. At 20 minutes, food starts to go into the intestine, releasing the signals of GLP-1 and PPY, and those ancient signals that cavemen used to listen to but have been shut off. And if you're not watching television or invited into a heated discussion, you may hear those signals again. So mindful eating is extremely important. It's the simplest thing that we can do. It's important to differentiate, again, hunger from cravings. I can eat a meal. I'm human like the rest of you. And 15 minutes later, I can smell pizza in another room. And all of a sudden, I want that pizza, and I'm not even hungry. You have to distinguish a crave from a hunger. Craving builds up fast. It's usually for a specific item. If you can divert your attention and walk away, that craving will be gone in 5 minutes, guaranteed. You have to know what you're putting in your mouth. It's okay to make a mistake once in a while. As long as you understand 1 M&M equals 1 football field of walking. I'll do the math for you later. In closing, I want to present this last slide. Enjoy what you eat. We're working from the right to the left. Build up your prefrontal cortex through exercise and through restraint. There is a role for people who have problems with this, with medication, bariatric surgery. But we're not going to discuss that today. But one last point I'd like to make. We seem to be fighting this alone, the doctor and the patient. We need to fight this as a society. We need to make our government more than just acknowledge that there's an obesity epidemic. We need something done about it. We need the Farm Bill to be revised. We need big businesses to stop polluting the internet and television with distractions that affect our kids who are trying to do the right thing. And this is the way that we're going to get McDonald's out of the kitchen. Thank you very much.